Welcome to Target. I'm Paula Durant from the Congregational Church, your host. This evening, my guests and my program are both very special. First, I'd like to say a word about the program. This evening, we're remembering and honoring Martin Luther King, Jr., whose birthday the nation is, for the first time, officially celebrating this year, for which we're very glad. The first part of my program will be a conversation with the folks who are sitting here now about a book that they've recently done and a book that they did a few years ago. Then we will go to a presentation, a slide and speech program put together by Bob Nemser, who is a host on another Channel 8 program. And then we'll go to a conversation with one of the gentlemen here and a third guest after we see the slides. Now, if I haven't thoroughly confused all of you, I'd like to introduce the guests who are here with me now. Starting at my far right is Bob Nemser, who is the host of Quick Clicks. And it's always nice to welcome a fellow host from Channel 8 to the program. Sitting to Bob's left is Flip Schulke, who is the photographer and has followed Dr. King for several years as a photographer, and his photographs are part of the books that you've brought with you today. To welcome you.
Thank you.
And sitting to Flip's left is Penny McPhee, who has other claims to fame, but wrote the text for the book, King Remembered, that she put together with Flip Schulke. I'd like to welcome you all. And I think I'd like to first talk to Bob a minute, because you did have a role in putting these books together.
Yes.
Even though your name is not appearing on the jackets and the covers. Would you talk to us, tell us about your role and how you accomplished it, with what goals?
My role was to take the words and the pictures and in a visual, communicative sense, put it together so that it not only kept the integrity of the words and the pictures, but also made sense as a chronology of the civil rights movement and Dr. King's life. And in order to do that, first you have to have a understanding of the movement and of Dr. King's life and the civil rights movement itself, and also an understanding of photography and the author that wrote the words and the photographer's wishes on how they would like the pictures conveyed. And the chemistry was right between Penny, Flip, and myself when we did the first book, which was in 1976, I believe, and then the new book, which is just out now and probably just getting into the stores.
Flip, you were following Dr. King for 8 years, as I understand it, as a photographer.
Yep. Yeah, 8 years. I met him in 1958 on an assignment for a Jet magazine, and he was giving a sermon, fundraising sermon in Miami, Florida. And Jet and Ebony covered almost everything Dr. King did. But in the South, they used, at that time, white photographers, because it was very difficult for a black photographer to move around in communities in the South. Segregation then was very strict.
In the late 50s.
Yeah. Well, there was still some strong segregation going into the 60s even. But there's certainly many of the legal barriers were broken, but there were cultural segregation in many of the smaller towns. And what happened with the photographers, the black photographers from Chicago, mainly from Johnson Publishing Company, who publishes Jet and Ebony, is that when they came into a small town, we had larger cameras in those days. And in those days, only a professional had that kind of equipment. Now, many, many, many people, thousands, have Nikons, Canons, and professional type cameras. So but in the early days, you could recognize instantly a photographer by the equipment he had, and they would arrest these black people and say, black photographers, and say they stole the equipment. And it would take a while. It was just harassment. It would take, they have to call Chicago, and they lose a day. So Mr. Johnson
And
decided
they lose the photographs that they were supposed to be there
to
take.
Yeah.
Is what So they hired a white photographer in order to avoid that.
problem. We always worked with a black reporter, but the reporter wasn't not identifiable. The reporter doesn't have to stand around with a pencil, and you don't know that a reporter is necessarily a reporter. So I met Dr. King, and I was very impressed by his speech sermon, and introduced myself afterwards, and he invited me to the minister's home for coffee. And we talked an awful long time. We probably got there, say, 10, 11 at night, and it was almost dawn before we got done talking. And I was just very interested in what he was saying, because he was using more than a religious, his primary background was a religious motivation, but he was using Gandhi, and then he was using philosophers from Greece and Middle Ages and all the way along. And he had, I thought, very good reasoning for what he believed in, and I had believed in the same things anyway. So I told him I wanted to document this, but the problem with a photographer is that you must be physically into place, and you also must be pointing your camera at the subject before it happens. And he said he hadn't really heard that kind of discussion before, and he was willing to do this. Let me explain very quickly. He was 1 year older than I am, and so at that time he was 29, I was 28. So by the time we were young kids. And he gave me his home telephone number and said I could call him, and I gave him mine, and he would call me when he knew things that were happening, not just with his organization, SCLC, which was new, but all different things in the South. And so it started then, and there was some type of nonverbal communication that went on back and forth between us, because he trusted me from the very beginning. And over the years, he permitted me in meetings that were where many things were discussed where absolutely they did not want exactly how they discussed them out. But I assured him that I wanted to photograph it when it really happened, not pose pictures. And I did not report the things I heard. Some things I asked afterwards is all of this closed? And they would say no, or he would say no, and I could tell a reporter what went on. And that's how I started with Dr. King, and I went all the way through his life. And then Coretta asked me to be in the house after he was killed during the funeral preparation. And we ended up with a picture on the cover of Life magazine of Coretta.
So you had a long and intimate history, and this part we want to talk about the technical and the superficial. Next part I want to talk more about the effect that had upon your own life and what you believe he meant in maybe your life and everyone's lives. Penny, what brought you to do the text for this book with Flip?
King Remembered is actually, as Bob and Flip mentioned, the second book on which the three of us have collaborated. And after the first book was very successful, Flip had asked me at that time to work with him, and I really began at that time in the process of researching the first book to learn about Dr. King and to really come to find it very important, his beliefs and philosophy, and that it was important to communicate. Since the publication of that first book, all three of us have had the opportunity to go into schools and into classrooms, and we found that a lot of young people today, and some adults, know that Dr. King was an important man, but they don't know why. So we all felt it was very important to do a second book that explained the philosophy of nonviolence in a little more detail, and that would be heavily pictures, but more text, more explanation of his achievements, of his beliefs, of his philosophy. And that was really the genesis of the second book, and we felt it was important to bring it out at the time when the nation would start to celebrate a holiday in his honor, so that it wouldn't be an empty holiday, so that we would have some deeper understanding of what the man and his movement were all about.
Why don't you, presuming we'll all run out and buy the book, I don't want you to give away the essence, but hold it up, and what would you say was the most important, the kernel of the message of Martin Luther King Jr.?
Well, let me say two things that I think are important about the book and lead into the message of Martin Luther King. One is that it contains a tremendous oral history of interviews that we did with all of the closest associates of Dr. King, Reverend Abernathy, Andrew Young, who's now the mayor of Atlanta, and you'll be talking with his daughter.
I wasn't going to introduce her that way.
I'm sorry. I apologize. Jesse Jackson, Jose Williams, all of the close aides of Dr. King who are still today active in their own way in achieving Dr. King's dream for a beloved community. So those histories we felt were very important to be preserved. That, I think, is what's unique about the book. The second thing that's quite unusual about the book is really the way the words and pictures are integrated. And this is really the achievement of Bob and Flip, that they work together almost like a television program. There isn't a section in the middle of the book that's pictures. They're interwoven so that they reinforce one another, and the message is like a television documentary.
So it's a well-designed.
I think it is. I think it is.
Bob, we're going to go now to the slideshow that you prepared, and I wonder if you would be the one who gave us the introduction about what we're going to see and hear in the next few minutes.
What the slideshow represents is a chronology of the civil rights movement and Dr. King. And it has narration by myself, Dr. King's speeches, photos by not only Flip, but some other photographers that were involved in the civil rights movement. And I tried to put this all together in a way that if you just heard the audio portion of it, you would know what's going on. And if you just saw the video portion of it, or the slides, you would know what's going on if you didn't hear the audio. And together, they give you the reinforcement of each other, and it's a very powerful story.
Thank you. Well, we'll go now to that production.
One day after finishing school, I was called to a little church down in Montgomery, Alabama. But one day, a year later, a lady by the name of Rosa Parks decided that she wasn't going to take it any longer. She stayed on a bus seat. You may not remember it because it's way back now, several years, but it was the beginning of a movement where 50,000 black men and women refused absolutely to ride the city buses, and we walked together for 381 days. Yes, sir.
A reign of terror followed the Supreme Court mandate. Montgomery's white power structure refused to accept the blacks' newly won equality without a fight. While trying to gain admittance to the trial of his colleague Ralph Abernathy on September 3, 1958, King is arrested for loitering on the courthouse steps in Montgomery. After King decides to serve 14 days in prison rather than pay the fine, his fine is mysteriously paid for by a city commissioner to prevent King from using the jail, quote, for his own selfish purposes, unquote. The sit-in and freedom ride movement begins in January 1960. The protests were often met with violence and hostility from whites. The first freedom riders were met with incendiary bombs when they reached Anniston, Alabama, on May 15, 1962. King agrees to serve as the chairman and spokesman for the Freedom Rider Coordinating Committee. James Swerg, a student from the University of Wisconsin, was beaten mercilessly when his Greyhound bus arrived in Montgomery on May 20th. Albany, Georgia provided the battleground for King's first major campaign after Montgomery. The protesters used the technique of mass confrontation for the first time. On July the 1st, 1962, police arrested a small group of teenagers gathered in front of the Albany Carnegie Library to pray and sing. In September 1962, James Howard Meredith becomes the first black student to enter the University of Mississippi. Segregationist agitators worked the Ole Miss students into a frenzy of hate. A violent mob swarmed the campus, throwing rocks, bricks, and Molotov cocktails. One U.S. Marshal, shot by the angry segregationists, had to wait hours before an ambulance is able to push its way through the crowd. National Guardsmen, federalized by President Kennedy, rounded up the rioters after the bloody battle. After a 16-month battle and a night of bloodshed, Meredith is finally enrolled as an Ole Miss student. King called Birmingham the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. King was arrested with his colleague Ralph Abernathy on April 12, 1963. From a cell in the Birmingham jail, King wrote,
I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are at present misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands.
Commissioner of Public Safety Eugene Bull Connor turned police dogs on the youthful demonstrators. The next day, newspapers throughout the world carried photos of dogs biting black children. Although the demonstrators practiced their lessons in nonviolence, the police responded with brutal force. King's labors in Georgia and Alabama were in many ways paralleled in Mississippi by the work of Medgar Evers, State Field Secretary of the NAACP. Medgar Evers is assassinated. For Merle Evers, Medgar's wife of 12 years, and his youngest son, Van, the days of loneliness begin. King and Abernathy mourned the death of their friend and colleague at a memorial service in Jackson, Mississippi on June 15, 1963. On the evening after Evers' death, with tears streaming down her face, his widow told a crowd of 900 people, quote, "Nothing can bring Medgar back, but the cause can go on." Tempered by Evers' death, protests and demonstrations throughout the nation spurred civil rights leaders to join forces with white labor leaders and clergymen in a massive March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. 250,000 people, 1/4 of them white, participated in the peaceful demonstration to pressure Congress to enact effective civil rights legislation. The voice of Martin Luther King Jr. hushes the crowd as he shares his dream of a future free from discrimination.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. That freedom reign, and when we allow freedom reign, when we let it reign from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
In Huntsville, Alabama, 4 black students were to enter 4 different schools. The Huntsville Board of Education sought to defy Wallace's anti-integration order and open the schools. Quote, "We want the governor and his troops to stay out of here," unquote, said one member of the board. On September 15th, 5 days after school integration finally began, a bomb exploded in Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 little girls and injuring dozens of worshipers. Many, both black and white, blamed Governor Wallace for the incident. Civil rights leaders and members of Congress witnessed the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on July the 2nd. King joined his father, Martin Luther King Sr., as co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia.
Now let me proclaim here and now that I am still convinced that the philosophy and practice of nonviolence affords a more excellent way to improve the inadequacies existing in the American social system. The method of nonviolent resistance is effective in that it has a way of disarming the opponent. It exposes his moral defenses, it weakens his morale, and at the same time it works on his conscience. I believe we will win it because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America.
King Sr. said of his son, "He had a sense of commitment. He was a human being and he loved his family. He loved his children. He was very much down to earth. But he had a sense of duty, of responsibility, and he let nothing get between him and it." For King, the pinnacle of public recognition and personal achievement came in 1964 when he received the Nobel Peace Prize.
I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind.
In August 1964, the bodies of civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were found buried in a dam near Philadelphia, Mississippi. The 3 young men had been working on the Mississippi Project, trying to register black voters. Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price of Philadelphia, Mississippi, was eventually convicted of conspiracy in the murders. The outrage of the murders had set the scene for Selma. State troopers sent by Governor Wallace commanded the marchers to halt at the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the outskirts of Selma. Bloody Sunday is broadcast over nationwide television, and Selma becomes a headline overnight. America and the world are outraged. Dallas County Sheriff James G. Clark and a posse of armed volunteers are largely responsible for the beatings. Singing a hymn to freedom, hundreds of clergymen from all over America answered King's call to protest the barbarism in Selma.
We shall not be moved alone. Hail Mary, we shall not be moved by the tree.
On March 18th, 80 S&C demonstrators are arrested for sitting in near the state capitol. Still others are driven from the vicinity of the Capitol by mounted police and deputy sheriffs. The 5-day march to Selma finally began on March 21st, 1965. While the demonstrations were going on in Selma, President Johnson presented his voting rights bill to a joint session of Congress, insisting, "We shall overcome." On his people-to-people tours in Alabama, King spoke to black church congregations in support of black candidates. Reverend T.E. Gilmore campaigned for sheriff in Greene County, Alabama. Lucius Amerson campaigned with his wife in Macon County, Alabama. Elected in 1966, he was the first black to hold the office of sheriff in the Black Belt since Reconstruction. Volunteers in Perry County, Alabama, taught new voters how to read the ballot so they could exercise their right to choose who would govern them. After a century of waiting, black voters stood patiently at the polls in Marion, Alabama, to cast their ballots in a state primary. King continued his constant pressure on President Johnson for increasingly forceful implementation of the Civil Rights Act. In early June 1966, James Meredith and a handful of friends decided to march through Mississippi. His intention was to test the progress of integration in his home state and to test his own courage. Meredith was shot by a sniper on the second day near Fernando, Mississippi. Hundreds took up the march, where Meredith was forced to leave it. When the marchers made a detour through Philadelphia, Mississippi, to hold a memorial service for the 3 slain civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, their reception was hostile. Sheriff Lawrence Rainey, still on duty although under indictment for the killings, stood by and watched as white mobs hurled cherry bombs while King spoke. King later describes that day as one of his most frightening experiences. The character of this march was different from any King had led in the past. The growing impatience of peaceful means and gradual progress became increasingly apparent. At a rally of 600 protesters in Greenwood, Mississippi, Stokely Carmichael called for black power. In 1966, King turned his attention to the rioting northern cities. King made poolroom pilgrimages in Chicago to cultivate the support of the young blacks. Black leaders decided to concentrate their efforts on discrimination in housing. Week after week, they marched on Chicago's all-white neighborhoods. When white youths in Cicero protested the Black March, they were held at bay by National Guardsmen, and King was struck by a rock in Cicero. King maintained a hectic pace during the Chicago campaign, speaking in cities throughout the nation. When black sanitation workers in Memphis received lower wages than their white counterparts, the union called for a work stoppage on March 28, 1968. King agreed to lead the march, although he was disturbed by Black Power militants. After conferring with his aides in the second-floor room of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis on April 4th, King and his friend Abernathy prepared to go to dinner. King stepped on the balcony of his room to chat with several associates in the parking lot below.
If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. And every now and then I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind. But I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I want to say. If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word of song, if I can show somebody he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian ought, if I can bring salvation to a world once wrought, if I can spread the message as the Master taught, then my living will not be in vain.
Welcome back. My guest, some have left and a new person has joined us. To my immediate right is Andrea Young, who is the Secretary for African Affairs in the United Church of Christ Board for World Ministries. I'd like to welcome Andrea, and I would say that she's here because I begged her, and because she wrote a masterful piece in the most recent Christianity in Crisis, a journal that clergy tend to read. I don't know how many lay folks read it. The lead article was on the effect that Martin Luther King's work had upon your life as a child, and we'll get to your sharing some of that. And Flip again has joined us, Flip Schulke, who is the photographer, because he too had some living experience of being with Dr. King. I must say as an introduction that having grown up myself in the community of Chicago where Breadbasket was going on and a lot of this was happening and been lifted up into that movement, I realized for myself that what was important to me was the high-mindedness of it all. It gave me an opportunity to be the best person I could be. And I heard those words again in that 15-minute clip we just had, and I was reminded of the power of the love and of that man and how that changed me. Now, having testified myself, we do miss that man. Flip, I'd like you to speak for a moment about something you said as an aside. As a photographer, you had a neutral view of the man and the message insofar as you were not coming from a religious perspective, but the religious dimension had deep meaning for you as you came to know him, and I'd like you to speak to that for a minute.
Yeah, I didn't make a misunderstanding, and I grew up in Minnesota, I grew up in a Lutheran Catholic town, and I grew up Catholic. I saw a lot of things within the church in which they said they were the teachers of morals. I'm talking now when I moved to the South in 1953, and I was 23 years old. That just weren't being done. Catholic schools were segregated, and I had a long talk with my parish priest about that. And I said, since you're supposed to be the leaders and the teachers and morals, shouldn't we do this first? And they said he had to wait until the federal government did it. And I said, why? And he said, well, once a year when we talk about brotherhood, we get no money in the plate. And I said, isn't it better not to have any church and meet in a tent and teach love and what Christ taught than to worry about the money getting on the plate. No, they disagreed with me. And it was very soon after that that I met Dr. King. And he renewed the beliefs that I had. I was raised a Christian. I just was kind of bouncing around because I was running into people in the religious area that I felt were too worried about paying the bills and not worried enough about faith and morals, especially morality. And this man did. This man came across. It's very, very difficult to explain this to people because I'm always asked this question about, what attracted you to Dr. King? There was just a feeling that when you were talking to him, and you were just attracted.
I would say that he attracted you to himself because there was a magnetic depth to his whole personhood, not just the words that were coming out of his mouth, but the whole quality of the witness of the man, the consistency between his word and his deed.
Yeah. And he also wasn't dogmatic.
The depth of his understanding of what it meant to be a Christian in the world. Those things draw us to people, and they drew many of every color to Martin Luther King Jr.
The other fantastic thing about Dr. King was that from the very beginning, there was absolutely no feeling of my color, or my religion, or my beliefs. It was me as an individual, and with him as an individual. And later on in some meetings where there were some arguments with some, he would let me go into meetings where they were discussing things that couldn't get out. And one time some other leaders said, we can't have this white man in here. And he specifically said, I don't care if he's green, purple, or pink. His color has nothing to do with it. I know him, I trust him, and I know that he will do what is right. And I still feel today that in the United States, this is the way we all have to live together, and actually worldwide. We're all human beings. And astronauts say this all the time as soon as they get away from the Earth. It is one Earth. And we do have friends, and we have cultural friends, and we have many reasons for why we associate with people in different, it can be religion, culture, background, everything.
What you're saying is many, many things separate us naturally and sometimes not naturally. Precious little unites us, but one of the things that unites us is the spaceship Earth and the realization of what a small world we really and how interconnected we all are.
But it's what Dr. King called the beloved community,
yeah,
though.
Absolutely.
We're all part of the beloved community. The whole world is part of that. And what I liked about him and what I have always felt is that people are born good, and what they may learn to be bad, but most people are good people.
Well, goodness breeds goodness also. And that's part of what he did.
But there is a theory that people are born evil and they learn to be good, or taught to be good, or religion teaches them to be good. And Dr. King looked upon the good side of everybody, and certainly he accepted the evil in George Wallace, and he combated that. But I think if you start with the fact that most people are good, and you work from that level, it's much easier to make the beloved community, because you can then feel that everybody you can like, and once in a while you find out that you can't accept this person, rather than being suspicious. What I'm trying to say is that it really bothers me when I'm judged as a generality. And this happened after Dr. King died with many blacks. They no longer looked at me as an individual. And this isn't just blacks. Magazine editors judge me because I live in Miami. Other people judge me because I'm a Midwesterner.
I think it's a common habit of human beings to be superficial rather than deep. I'd like to move with your notion of the beloved community, because it seems such a good transition to move to Andrea. I know a lot about her work because she works for my denomination, and we get mail all the time about what you folks are doing over there. And it's all excellent work. But Andrea wrote a piece in Christianity in Crisis, and I'd like you to share as much of that story as you can.
Well,
The editors of Christianity in Crisis approached me about doing an editorial for their issue commemorating the first legal public holiday of celebrating Dr. King. And it was a great opportunity for me to sort of pull together things that I have struggled with over a long period of time. I grew up in the civil rights movement. The things that we were going through in this film were the conversation around my dinner table. And so for me, it's very personal, and it's difficult for me to translate that in a lot of ways so that it can be understood in the larger community. For me, every event that occurred in the civil rights movement was something that was happening with my family, but it was also something that my future hedged upon. I began school in first grade in segregated schools. I attended integrated schools when I as it progressed later in the South, that private and public schools became integrated. The opportunities that I enjoy now were certainly not something I could take for granted when I was 5 years old. It's certainly not something my mother could take for granted. I happen to be a lawyer. That's not something that a black female child could expect to be in 1955 when I was born.
It's unusual for female and unusual for black.
But the thing that is so tremendous as I work now in Africa, and as South Africa is such an important issue facing us today, is that these things were accomplished, these tremendous changes in society, how society was ordered, structure, legal truths in society, cultural practices, was it was accomplished nonviolently. And when you think back to Dr. King was the person he was, but he was also riding a wave of history. There was going to be movement in the black community. PhDs were not going to continue to teach high school and be satisfied with that. The children of doctors and who had master's degrees in engineering were not going to continue to be Pullman porters forever. The changes were going to happen, and the question was it going to happen in a way that made us a better society? Was it going to happen in a constructive way, or was it going to happen in a destructive way, as with the riots that we did see in the 60s? And Dr. King was able to channel that energy and use the strength of the black church, which had for so many years been really the only institution that developed black leadership, that provided an outlet for blacks, and a structure and an organization that couldn't be influenced by the white community that might oppose these kinds of changes, and could channel the energy of that institution into a movement that was both religious and political. And I think that it is difficult to imagine today what our future would have been like otherwise. I think Lebanon is maybe a good example, that our cities could look very much like Beirut today if that kind of love had not gone into changes.
That is frightening to think of. I hadn't considered that. Looking back and saying, what if? Yeah. I was in Chicago. It was interesting to me. I was born in Chicago and then was back there to go to graduate school right at the time that the Cicero episode we saw and the Marquette Park episode were occurring. And I remember being shocked. I was so innocent and naive. I remember going there and being shocked at the anger I saw from my relatives. I mean, those from neighbors and friends of people I knew. And I guess the depth of the problem as a Northerner who had really been raised with parents who taught me not to hate anybody and to be concerned. Although I grew up in a white community, I was never taught bigotry. The coming round and round and round to realize the problem shocked me. And I absolutely think you're right. The most important thing Dr. King did was bring about needed and appropriate change without any significant amount of violence in this nation, without tearing cities apart.
And so much of the response comes out of fear and ignorance. And so Dr. King would say it's important for you to behave in such a way that you're not trying to achieve something so that you can oppress other people, but that you want all of us to live together. And so that's what Christ was talking about when he said, love your enemies. And that's what Lincoln was talking about, where if you make an enemy your friend, that you have not only gotten rid of an enemy, but you have gained a friend. And that's really the way he lived his life and tried to show other people that it really can work. And I've used it in more personal conversations or interactions, and it really can work. Like bullies on the schoolyard and so forth.
Even as you were growing up?
As I was growing up, it was a tremendous burden to be raised with that kind of personal philosophy.
I imagine it was. I mean, there was a lot on you that wasn't on normal kids.
But when a bully at school threatened me, my father's response was, well, you should go and talk to them and be nice to them. Because they just want attention. They just need somebody to make them feel like they're a good person. And if you have the nerve and the courage to do it, I found that it works.
A hard job you had growing up. I know most parents think, well, go sock them, just stand up for yourself. But it absolutely is a model for most human relations and almost all international problems. And it's just a far more difficult way for us to live. I keep over and over again the one phrase of Dr. King's that will not leave me alone is judging people on the content of their character. I find that to be such an appropriate concept in many, many settings. Mm-hmm. The focusing on what is the content of my character, and what is the content of this other person's character, what's being said here, what am I communicating here? Mm. To me, that's powerful. And as I heard you speaking in another way of that same thing when you grew up with the demand that you get yourself together in order to be able to turn enemies into friends. Whereas I came to need that in my life as an adult because I didn't grow up with that same sort of movement phenomenon in my living room. It must work. You're wonderful. I mean, you have a career. You're doing a wonderful job in the United Church. I know. I heard that from somebody the other day. So it must work.
Oh, thank you.
Again, some of those things are cultural because I grew up in Minnesota in a small town. And we didn't fight as kids. You didn't, maybe it was empirical learning. It wasn't so much my parents said not to fight. I found out very, very young that if you treated somebody who was giving you a hard time decently, most of the time they'd back off. And I know Dr. King one time, he said it many times, but he also said it in private, that we're never going to win an armed, we meaning the blacks, the percentage, but couldn't win an unarmed revolution in the United States, even if they wanted to. But he said beyond that, in America, Americans feel, generally speaking, that they're good people. And the way to make change is to show that in certain areas they're not being good people.
And
that's
they're
why
capable of becoming good people.
Yeah, and that's why he had a tremendous respect for journalists and for what we did. Because he felt if the people in the rest of the country could see this, what was happening, what Andrea knew was happening, what blacks in the South knew was happening, but the majority of the country really didn't know it. And it's the same thing that's coming out of South Africa now.
That's
For
right.
years we've known what's going on in South Africa. But if you see those pictures now, I mean, I thought when I was watching those pictures and I saw those beatings, yes, we were beaten here, but 2 civil rights bills came through with some dogs and some hosings. I'm not saying some people got killed too, but then I saw the statistics from 1 year in South Africa. 850 or 875 black people were killed by the authorities, and I think 7 or 8 whites have died, or 10, in 1 year.
Oh, I know.
And then we should appreciate immensely the leadership of Dr. King. I mean, I argued this with Life magazine, who I worked for, when they wouldn't recognize what he was doing. They kept following the more violent methods and saying, That's never going to work in America.
Well, a lot of times the news goes for what's sensational,
I agree.
and there was a subtlety in a way about what was accomplished with the civil rights movement, and I think one of the questions that is still being answered is really what are the goals, and I think that has a lot to say about your methods. I mean, Dr. King was never a person to say that you can justify your goals. Justify your methods by your goals. He was always to say that what our goal is what our method is. And that one criticism he had of American society is that we have substituted the means of life for the ends of life. That instead of having a home as a place to nurture your family, I mean, we have a home as a status symbol. And he was that way about the movement, that if we are about forming the beloved community, then that is also our process. And I think you see the fruits of that, of not following that so much in the world, that the gains that are won by violent struggle continue to live with the reverberations of that violence.
That's right.
But the gains that are accomplished through nonviolence and through love and through really trying to help people understand a new way to be in the world, that these are changes that last. Even today, to say that 20 years, from Brown versus the Board of Education, it is now considered completely unacceptable to talk about segregation as a norm. It's unacceptable to talk about, to have racist views. And that's a phenomenal change.
In a short time.
In a very short period of time.
Mm-hmm. It is.
And it's certainly not something that you can do by throwing bombs.
Well, it's so short in putting the pictures up that we have an exhibition in Albany that the state of New York has put up. When there were a lot of people watching, and a lot of young black students watching these that are being put up, and when they saw the captions, this was told me by the exhibitor and the director putting them up, and they said, I didn't know that we couldn't vote, I mean generally across the country and all over the South before 1963. I didn't know that we couldn't do this. I didn't know we couldn't do that. Because the holiday is upon us, the first holiday, what I'm trying very hard in my own way to do is to keep the memory of Dr. King from being a memory and being an icon and being a carved in stone figure from the past 20 years ago, and what he did then has no bearing on what we do today. There's a specific instance that just came up in the paper, and you know about it, but they're talking a lot about the sanctuary movement. There are not only individuals and groups, but even communities that are past breaking laws, naturalization law, federal law. They're doing exactly what he taught us to do, and that is that there is an unjust law. It is your duty to break that law, but you must accept the punishment that comes with it until you can correct it. And that's one difference between him and what happened, I think, with a lot of people who became involved in the Black Power movement. And that was, they wanted to change the laws and break the laws, but they weren't willing to accept the consequences.
I started, I think, and that's what you're saying again, by saying there was a consistency between his word and his deed.
Yeah.
He lived as he said we should live, including willing to take the consequences when he felt it was an unjust law that needed to be challenged in some fashion. I'd like to add something. He was clearly a man of his place and time, and clearly rode the crest of the black need for change in this nation. I mean, the sense of the segregation had to end. But he was clearly more than that also. I need to maybe testify a little that I felt, especially as he began to question the Vietnam War and to raise questions about the nuclear problem in the 60s, the mid-60s, to raise questions about the nuclear problem, that he was far more than a man calling for the integration of our nation. He was a prophetic voice on many levels.
Yeah, Dr. King called for divestment in 1962 and said then, gave a speech then that is quite current today, that the economic power of the West is shoring up apartheid, and that whenever the West decides that apartheid is repugnant and that it truly does not accept South Africa as a government in the free world, that apartheid can be brought to an end.
In 1962.
And that economic power is, a primary means of nonviolent action in the international sphere that should be used.
So
that
he
was
could be
1962.
saying that today.
That's right.
Yeah, that's why I'm very happy about the holiday. It has brought, I know from my own, the fact that I have this collection of pictures, there has not been the interest in Dr. King. His own books went out of print. And I'm very happy. I went down in New York City 3 days ago, and the whole 3 huge windows are full of his original writings that are reprinted. It was terrible they went out of print, because I am very, very strong. I have very strong feelings that if you read his complete sermons, his complete talks, you see reasoning all the way through. And even if you might not be religious, he gave other reasons for this. He used other things so that if a person hasn't a religious background, they still can be convinced that there is a beloved community.
So you would encourage all of us to read all of the published works as a method, which is always a wonderful.
And that's why.
And especially, I think, his small book of sermons, Strength to Love,
It's a wonderful book.
that I think was published in 62 or 63, but it's just a book that I read over and over and over again, and there are just so many truths in there, and in such powerful language, and not only for social movement kind of context, but also in a personal faith journey context.
And they're all available again. It was very difficult. Libraries are great, but books are out very often in the library, and I think these kind of books you should have in your home. And if you have children especially, they're things that you should have your children read, because I don't know anybody in this country, and our past in this country, that ever enunciated this method and this way of living and love for fellow human beings as Martin Luther King did.
Who articulated it for the modern individual.
Yeah.
There's many people in history, but as a modern, current person, there's no other voice that spoke with such power and depth. We have only about 30 seconds left, and I wonder if there's a 10-second conclusion either of you feel impelled to add, something we haven't covered that you just need to include.
Well, I would just say that I think the holiday is important, not just as a celebration of the growth and development of black people in America, but of the kind of country that America can be, and we certainly are not there now. But this is the kind of potential that we have as a nation to really be a shining beacon of light for the whole world.
Thank you, Andrea. With that, I would encourage all of us to consider what observing the holiday really is about in the United States. This is Paula Durant from the Congregational Church. Thank you for watching Target. Good evening.
My four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.